WinterLatinaShow.
Hosted by IDM.
Perfect.
And we are live. I have to apologize today. That's my fault that it took so long. I was slightly late. Nina, how are you doing today?
I'm very caffeinated and ready to go. Welcome to another fun-filled episode of the Winter Latina Show. Happy Chinese New Year for those who celebrate. I know this is going to get some people annoyed because they like to call it the lunisolar New Year, but we'll just call it Chinese New Year. So it's the year of the snake. Hopefully the snake brings us all good luck. I know I'll be accused of paganism after I said that as well, so be that as it may. So before we get into this particular episode, and today we're going to do a fun history story time. And don't worry, history story time always has a little bit of politics. So for those of you who are here for politics will have that too. But I'm going to be one of those really annoying people and ask you to help me out with a little bit more engagement. And I always get annoyed when I hear big YouTubers ask to like, share, subscribe, comment, and turn on the notification bell. But the reason they do this is because the way YouTube works. So the initial YouTube video goes out to a smaller group of people, and YouTube basically measures how much engagement there is on that video. And if that engagement is good, it then pushes it out to a larger audience and a larger audience. And from what I've noticed, even on my little YouTube channel, which is a lot smaller than my large Twitter account, is that when there are a lot of comments after the episode has launched for the live stream, that's when it gets more views. So if you guys would like to help me out, especially those of you who keep telling me that my channel should be larger, I agree. Please comment on this video or any other videos in the future. This was a long introduction. Let's jump into the episode. Marcelo, as before, is pretty much unaware of what I'm going to be talking about. So Marcelo, you're welcome to interrupt and jump in with any kind of commentary that you see fit. And Marcelo's reactions are real reactions. He's not the top Hollywood actor here. So, or maybe he is in disguise. Maybe they train him in Brazil.
Who knows? Who knows?
Who knows?
Who cares?
Who knows? Who cares? Exactly. So here we are. We are in a beautiful summer day in a very old, beautiful historical city. In fact, the date is June 13th. The man that we're looking at is 40 years old. He is quite accomplished and established. In fact, he is famous and admired by many people in his country. And he decides to give himself a little break. He decides to go on a bike ride. What better way to relax a little bit than by either going on a solitary walk, which is what I would do, maybe hike, or by riding a bike throughout the city. So he decides to ride his bicycle right on the road. The road is pretty empty, and so he's riding along. There are really few to no cars, and bam, all of a sudden, here comes this truck. It's huge. It's driving erratically. It ends up turning into oncoming traffic, but there's no oncoming traffic other than a cyclist, and bam, he hits the cyclist. What happens to the cyclist? He flies off the bicycle, hits the hard concrete of the sidewalk, and he cracks his skull open. Naturally, he is taken to the hospital, but he doesn't survive. So he ends up dying in this absolutely freak accident on a beautiful summer day on June 13th. But even though this accident was obviously deadly, this is how his life ended. This by far is not the most dangerous event in which he participated throughout his fairly short life. Like I said, he was 40 when he died. He participated in many dangerous events. And one of such events we're going to focus on today. And as luck would have it, maybe bad luck, or some would say fate, the event we're going to talk about also happened on June 13th, many, many years prior to this freak accident in which the cyclist died. So at that time, he was about 25 years old. Now, this particular event was the biggest and the bloodiest heist in the entire history of the country where he lived. I know I called it the heist of the century, which is kind of an expression in the title of this video, but it's actually even bigger than that. Now, it's not the biggest heist in terms of the amount of money that the people that we're talking about stole. They stole, according to various estimates, anywhere from 6 to 16 million in today's USD. They stole it in their original currency. And I've seen all kinds of estimates for the original amount of money that was taken that fluctuates. So even if we think about the lower number, 6 million instead of 16, that is a huge number. So this is how much money they stole. As a result of this heist, 40 people ended up dead and 50 people ended up injured, according to most sources that I've seen. So this is not just a bank heist about which you maybe saw a true crime episode somewhere, or you might have watched a movie. Usually those things are not nearly as bloody as you probably know. So this is why it's considered the most major heist in this country's history. Now, a rival group actually managed to steal more money in the year prior. However, they stole this money from a private institution and a group of very wealthy businessmen. Now, this particular heist targeted not just a state bank, but it targeted the state treasury. So sort of the highest levels of financial and political power in this country. But even though they stole a ton of money, they were actually unable to use most of this money as a result, and then you'll see later why. One of the participants, in fact, the cyclist that passed away, actually ended up being caught, and he went on trial not once, but twice. Another participant managed to get away. He was a participant and an organizer, and there are lots of theories about his role. And yet another participant actually ended up having heard about the arrest of the now deceased cyclist. Obviously, many years prior to that, he ended up grabbing his family and fleeing across a frozen body of water as the lake, I think it was a lake, as the ice was cracking underneath his feet. And later he said that this would have been a really stupid way for him to die, to travel on foot over ice as this ice was cracking. So this heist also received international media attention. These headlines are still very much searchable online all these many years later. And it really damaged the reputation of these people, who later became very, very important. They became important statesmen, and this is where we're going to get into. But before we talk about the reasons for the heist, let's talk about the heist itself. So, as I said, the actual heist took place on the same date, on June 13th. And this was not the first such event, such criminal act that this group participated in. And for the sake of brevity, I'm only going to focus on these three individuals that I named. There were multiple people involved, but we would be here for hours. We might have to do, at some point in the future, when you guys help me get to 1 million subscribers, we're going to have to do like some kind of a deep dive, a multi-part episode, which I personally enjoy when other people do that, and they give you a lot of information in each episode, and you really get to learn the history of each particular event. So we're going to focus on three people. So if you're upset when you learn later what we're talking about, that I excluded some people, it's basically for the sake of brevity and not keeping us here for many, many hours. Although I know you might want to stick around. So this particular individual, the cyclist whom I mentioned in the beginning, he was about 25 years old. And in this group, he was very much respected despite his fairly young age. He was basically, think of like a mafia organization. He was basically the muscle. He would do whatever was necessary. It didn't matter how bad it was. It didn't matter how dangerous it was. It was almost as if he didn't really have a sense of danger, a sense of fear, because he would just do it. And another member of this organization, who was one of the two organizers that I'm going to focus on, he was older. He was about 37 years old. He was well respected in this organization and actually outside of it too. And he had a wife, but he didn't have any children. And the final member, the organizer of this particular event, and also a major member of this organization, he was 29 years old. He was friends with both of these men, and he was a newlywed. He just got married to the love of his life, and the year prior, they just had a brand new baby. He was very happy with his little family. And he happened to live at this time in the city where they were organizing a heist. He didn't always spend time in the city, but at this particular time, he, his wife, and his little baby son were in the city. So in terms of organizing, it made sense for him to be involved. And he's been involved in other events that basically earned him a particular reputation where he was well respected for these, these and other types of actions. So these are the three people that I'm going to focus on. Now, this is not the first robbery of this kind that this group participated in. They've done other similar things before, but nothing really on this scale. In fact, when it comes to this particular type of robbery where they targeted the state, this was their third attempt. In one of the attempts, the man, the cyclist, the 25-year-old whom I mentioned in the beginning, he was actually, as the muscle, he himself was putting together some explosives for the heist, and he screwed up as he was attaching the detonator. Yeah, Marcelo is smiling. This is not what you want to screw it up with, right, Marcelo?
Just like the suicidal bomber that Israel released these days that was convicted by 3 suicidal bombing. All right.
Yeah, I know. So this is what I mean. This is like we were laughing, but obviously it's a serious matter. So basically, as he screwed up, as he was attaching the detonator, according to some sources, the thing blew up in his face. And by his face, I mean literally in his face. So he was injured in his face, and I believe his hands were injured too. But despite the seriousness of the situation, she just kind of brushed it off and kept going with the plan. So basically, that just, again, shows you that this is why he was the muscle. This is why he was respected as the guy who will go as far as necessary, regardless of the physical difficulties, including such a serious injury as the one that he experienced. Now, another attempt, according to some sources, at a heist of this nature, targeting the state, had to end sort of halfway through, which of course for this group was very frustrating. They were actually physically riding the train that was transporting money that they were going to steal. However, the train was traveling through basically the middle of nowhere in the mountains, and they didn't really know the terrain very well. So they relied on these people that were supposed to serve as their guides to kind of get them out of there when they take the money and hop off the train. But the guides basically freaked out. They did not deliver their part of the bargain, and the heist kind of had to stop before the money was taken. So this was attempt number 3, as they say, right? Third time is the charm, or this is sort of a negative charm for, as far as these criminal acts go. And this group was very clear. They quickly understood that they couldn't really target this institution, right, the state treasury, by going inside one of their buildings, because these are some of the most well-protected buildings in the country. This would be very difficult, very dangerous, and probably not worth it. So they figured out that the best way to obtain this money would be by targeting it as it's being transported from one place to another. Again, if you like these sorts of movies, or even if you've seen true crime, this is not uncommon in this criminal industry, in this sector of the criminal industry, right, to target a vehicle instead of the actual physical building, because it's just easier, there are fewer people involved, and so on and so forth. So this was exactly their thinking. Now, when you are going to target the state and you're trying to steal a huge amount of money, you need someone on the inside. And so eventually this group ended up having a few informants that would provide them with information about the schedules, the amounts of money that would be transferred, and then they could sort of consolidate and come up with a particular plan and a specific date and a specific location. One person on the inside was actually friends with, or a good acquaintance of the man who was the newlywed with his beautiful wife, the love of his life, and his little son, a little baby who was less than 1 year old. And this man on the inside, I'm not sure if he was sort of helping out beyond the fact that he was a friend, if he was getting some kind of financial compensation for his insider information, but he worked for this delivery service that would be transporting the money. So this is how they got some of the information. And so on the day of the heist, as I said, this was also June 13th. So imagine this is a large city. It's a very, by the standards of the time, it was a large city. It was a very, very old city. It's a beautiful city with many old historical buildings, with cobblestone, with narrow streets, with beautiful churches. And where this was supposed to take place is basically the central part of the city. According to some reports, these robbers actually ended up going to a nearby restaurant and kind of hanging out there waiting for the convoy with the vehicle that was transporting all this money to go through. One report I saw was that as random people were walking into this restaurant, and I thought it was interesting because it's like first thing in the morning and they're walking in to drink, but I guess it's 5 o'clock somewhere, right? Even. So I thought that was kind of funny. Maybe it's for them, it might be a cultural thing too. And supposedly people were able to walk in, but then the doors were sort of barricaded and they were not able to leave for these robbers to, engage in their stakeout and then the eventual participation in the physical part of the heist. Now, the numbers of actual people involved in the actual physical part of the heist, not the organizing, again, different sources vary. I'll go with the number 20, which is what I saw in a few sources, and that's a very big number. Again, if you ever watch true crime or movies, there might be 3 people who are actually physically doing it, maybe a half dozen. I don't think I've ever seen one that had 20 actual participants, not the organizers, not some kind of informants, but the actual participants who would go and steal this money, which shows you that it's a pretty well organized operation for this group. And like I said, it's not the first one in which they took part. And supposedly there was a girl on the outside who was also one of the people involved in this criminal act. And she had a newspaper. And once she saw the vehicle carrying the money with the convoy, so imagine this vehicle is being protected by, the state, but it's also being protected by local police. So it's, even though it's a vehicle, it's well protected on the outside of the city. She basically waved the newspaper, which was supposed to be the sign for the robbers to get into high gear and kick into action, which is what they did. So the initial attack involved some robbers shooting their pistols and others throwing these homemade explosives at the feet of the policemen and the people who were protecting this armed convoy, this vehicle that was carrying all the cash. Because this was a city, this was a large city, and this was near buildings, not only did a lot of injuries occur at this point, but also a lot of the windows were blown out because of all of the explosives. And I imagine totally innocent bystanders, it's a morning, it's a large city, were injured in this initial attack as well. However, it did not take out the vehicle. It kept going. And I think this is why the casualty toll is so large, is because it didn't happen in one location. They basically had to chase it throughout the city and repeatedly attack it with these homemade explosives, throwing it under the feet and the wheels, et cetera, until it was stopped and they were able to get a hold of the money and escape. So initially this was complete chaos, right? The official casualties, like I said, in a lot of the media and sources reported are 40 deceased and 50 injured, which is a huge, huge number. But I think you can kind of understand why the number was so huge. It was the method. It wasn't just pistols or any other kind of firearms that they're using. They were using explosives. So you can almost compare this to like a modern terrorist attack, which in those cases, it's not so much about money, right? Those cases are more ideological or purely ideological, I guess. But I think we could still make this comparison as well, especially when we learn sort of the greater context of this particular heist. Now, as far as the participation of this the newlywed, let's call them, the 29-year-old, there's lots of theories, at least three. One theory is that he didn't just organize, he wasn't just one of the key organizers for this heist. He actually physically participated in it as well. One source said that he stood on the roof of one of the buildings. He was the one throwing the initial explosives and causing the initial injuries. Another source said that no, he did not physically participate in this, but he was pretty close by to the point where he could witness what was going on. He was either on a balcony or he was on the roof of the buildings, slowly smoking a cigarette, totally calm, just observing this madness that was happening. Yet another source said that because he was an organizer, he didn't want any physical participation in this, so that as basically a way to gain an alibi, he was way, way, way in a different part of the city. One of the locations that he's described to be at is a train station, which I guess would have a lot of witnesses as to, where he was. He wasn't physically present there. And finally, another source said that his young wife with their baby son was actually not too far. So he could see the absolute madness, the chaos that was unfolding. And she wasn't privy to what was going on. So she was terrified and she ran back inside to basically protect her child. Who knows? I don't think this is something we will ever know, because the information about some of these direct participants comes from eyewitnesses, and we kind of know that eyewitness reports are not always very credible. You kind of have to compare them to each other. And because this heist later received a lot of really bad publicity, especially when it came out as to who participated in it, the key people, the key organizers really did as much as they could to distance themselves from what had happened. So if they themselves didn't really talk about their participation and the eyewitness reports were really kind of random, I don't think we'll ever know about, the role of the newlywed here. And the older man that I described, he was not physically there. So he was one of the organizers, he was one of the masterminds, but he was in a completely different part of the country. So he did not make any explosives, but I think he was well aware of what was going on. Marcelo, before we talk about the aftermath, what is your impression? Do you ever watch movies like this?
Well, yeah, La Casa de Papel. It's not a movie, it's a 5-year series. Yeah, of course, who cares mentioned Ocean's 11 kind of stuff. One thing that caught my attention, we had two very interesting. I like what you're talking about in Brazil, and what calls my attention is the fact that, well, first of all, they did it 3 times, and probably we're talking about a different era, but going free after 3 times, you have to have something behind you. You have to have something, and exactly because of these crimes that happen in Brazil, there's even a Netflix movie or documentary about one of them, and there's a movie about the other one. These crimes usually are financed because it's very expensive to do things like that. People usually think like Ocean's 11, or I don't know, people just gather together on a living room and say, hey, that's a good idea, let's have a drink and go for it. But it's very expensive. As you mentioned, you have explosives, you have guns, you have 20 people, you have to plan this very careful, you have to buy information, you have to bribe people, you have to do a lot of stuff. So usually those crimes are very related to something big, either a big crime organization or some state sponsored or some intelligence sponsored things like that. Those are my first impressions. The history so far is very good. I'm actually paying attention, a lot of attention on it.
Well, for once you're paying attention to me. Thank you.
I didn't say that, but it sounded like that. Sometimes things comes out of my mouth, and just after that, I listen and say, yeah, that sounds weird.
No, I know you're right. Running all the technical stuff. So, but yes, finally, I'm paying attention to Nina after 47 episodes.
I'm not even looking at who cares here in the comments.
All right. Well, it's exactly what you're saying. There are sort of two things in play here. One of them is that this is a different time when perhaps in one way it was easier to carry something like this out. But at the same time, if you ever pay attention to either real stories or fictional stories in movies, you'll see that it's not always, even if the initial phase of appropriating the money is successful, it's not always easy to get away with it because money has serial numbers. And this is precisely the problem that this group ran into. The smaller bills were usable, but the larger bills were all known. The government knew exactly what the serial numbers were for these large banknotes. And so even though they got away with anywhere, and I gave you the estimate, somewhere between $6 to $16 million in today's money, right? This is a different currency. They were really unable to use most of it after all this effort. Now, initially, what they did, and this to me also sounds like, did they really do that? They kept the money in one of the apartments so the co-conspirators' apartments in the city, but of course it couldn't stay in the city. They had to leave. So what do? They sew it into a mattress. Now, if you ever consume any true crime and there are mattresses being transported from place to place, that's probably one of the biggest red flags. There's either a dead body in it or something being hidden. But I guess this is a different time. It was perfectly normal to transport a mattress from one part of the country to another part of the country, which is what they did. And believe me, they went very far. They went thousands of miles to transport this mattress. I'm not sure how many weeks or days this took, but they successfully transported it to the older organizer's home, who was in a very, very different part of the country in the north. So he got a hold of the money. In the meantime, the state was obviously very heavily investigating this absolutely brazen event that led to a lot of injuries, a lot of deaths, and they lost a lot of money from the state treasury. So of course, it was also embarrassing for them. There was a lot of international publicity as well, as I've said, in many, many different countries. And so they started arresting some of the kind of lower people in the food chain, people that might have one banknote and they went and they tried to exchange it, or somehow information was given to them and someone basically gave it up. And the lower people in the food chain, probably outside of the 20 that somehow got a hold of this money, started being arrested in that city pretty quickly. Now, the bulk of the money that was sewn into the mattress was taken into various countries, mostly in Europe, but also in the United States. And they tried to exchange this money at the same time, thinking that, even if there are serial numbers, if we do it all at the same time in all these different countries, we might succeed at least in some cases. And in a couple of cases they did. There was a case where in one place they sort of exchanged money with a private individual instead of a bank that would be probably paying attention to serial numbers. So they succeeded here and there, but in most cases they did not. And in fact, this is the way in which the man, the muscle, the mafia muscle that I referred to him as, the cyclist who died in the beginning of this episode, ended up being arrested. He was actually arrested in Germany. And he was in communication with a man that he thought he could trust, but this man actually happened to be an informant. He betrayed him. He basically gave him up to the German police, and the German police was in contact with this, the country of origins authorities, and he was extradited there. And when you commit a crime of this nature and you're not just a mastermind, but you're a direct participant, what's going to face you in terms of the criminal sentence is going to be the death sentence. So the best way that he thought of getting away with this particular crime was to pretend to be completely batshit crazy. Now, these days, I'd like to think that psychiatry is a little bit more developed, and multiple psychiatrists can examine an individual pretending to be in unfit to stand trial and to have various very serious mental health conditions on top of that. And they can probably, in a lot of cases, see through any kind of fakery. In this particular case, apparently they could not. This man was examined by multiple specialists from different countries, including foreign countries, and they all concluded that he was batshit crazy. And he would just do, again, if the sources are to be believed, bizarre things. He would completely ignore the trial proceedings. He would talk to his pet bird. He would sit in a cell and stare at one spot for hours. So basically all the things that you would read about different mental health conditions, it seems like he kind of put them all together. And even more gross things that I'm not going to get into, but you can imagine bodily functions and the gross things that you can do with your bodily functions to come across as just not caring about yourself as a human being. Go ahead. Your mic is off. Mic is off.
What happened?
Yeah.
I really thought you were going to tell me that this guy pretended to fake his death, and that was the initial scene of the history. Him getting hit by the truck and faking.
Well, that was many years later. Right. That was many years later. But that does kind of tell you that he didn't get the death sentence. And so initially he was deemed to be crazy and unfit to stand trial because I guess his manipulations worked. In fact, one of the sources I read was really brutal. Apparently they used some kind of a pain test on him, and it sounded like torture, where they stuck needles under his nails to see if he even responds to pain, and he didn't. So I guess he was really just dedicated to not showing. Yeah, it was just, no sense of fear, didn't care about those explosives in his face with the initial attempt. And yeah, this crazy test that they did on him in terms of pain, he didn't respond at all. So basically he was sort of in this limbo in prisons for a couple of years. And then he masterminded his escape. And this is when he knew he was not crazy. So just a few years later, I think he spent about 3 years in prison or so. He was pulled back in, and once again he was charged and he was facing the death penalty, and this time he could not pretend to be crazy. But there was a change in the legislation, in the legal system of the country, where his death sentence was basically commuted to not a life sentence, but about 20 years of a long prison sentence and kind of, not the best conditions. So he ended up escaping death, as you could see now, multiple times with, the initial explosives in his face, with the actual heist, the death sentence, and the claiming to be batshit crazy, and now this next one. And then, of course, eventually in a few years, the political system changed, and then he was just out. So he was really lucky, but I guess he is like a cat with 7 lives or 9 lives, right? Eventually, your 9 lives run out, and then you get hit by a truck on the same day, but many years later, and you die in an absolutely, pointless way. He could have, kept living and doing other, maybe less crazy things. But the let's go back to the newlywed. Be that as it may, we don't know the extent of his actual physical participation. We know he was one of the organizers, but very sadly, the love of his life, his wife, who was only 22 years old, she passed away from a serious lung illness. She had either tuberculosis or another related condition. So he was obviously very distraught. He had just married her the year prior. So, they're a young couple. They had this new baby. And he ended up, due to his lifestyle, where he was never in the same place for a long time, he ended up leaving this young son with his wife's relatives. And he never really spent much time with them after that, due to his lifestyle and the particulars of his situation. And the final organizer, who ended up fleeing over ice and almost dying by falling through, he ended up successfully fleeing and sort of staying outside and evading that particular investigation. So at this point, I should probably mention that the newlywed that I talked about is Joseph Stalin, the future leader of the Soviet Union. The man who almost fell through ice is Vladimir Lenin, the father of the Russian Revolution. And the cyclist is probably less known to you, but he was one of the prominent Bolsheviks at the time. His name is Simon Petrosyan. He was Armenian. His nickname, and in most sources, he is actually, his name is mentioned, but he is referred by his nickname, which is Kamo. And supposedly his nickname comes from, he had an Armenian accent when he spoke the Russian language, so he mispronounced to whom or for whom in Russian, which is kamu, and so people just ended up calling him Kamo, Kamo, Kamo because he mispronounced it. So whom should I take this to? Where, for whom should I give this? Blah, 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 blah. This is why he had this nickname, supposedly. Now, they're all revolutionaries. They all had many nicknames, but he's the one that for some reason, even in official sources, is more frequently referred by the nickname than by his actual last name. So he was, these days, he's probably a lesser known revolutionary, maybe in the West. He's certainly known in the history of the Russian Revolution. But the two organizers, Lenin and Stalin, who ended up, of course, really, really distancing themselves because of the bad publicity and the disappointment coming from other ideologically similar, maybe less aggressive socially democratic parties in Europe. I think that was one of the reasons why they decided to, other than the fact that this was, a crime, they really decided to distance themselves from this particular event. This was not the only heist, like I said, in which they participated. So Marcelo, now that you know the identities, before I talk a little bit more about the context, what do you think?
Holy crap, that's my first reaction. if you guys want a true reaction, I think you saw I didn't use crap. I used another word, but it was muted for the sake of YouTube. Wow. Is this serious? Is this for real?
Yeah, this is for real. You can go on our favorite source, Wikipedia, or any trust. Well, I'm saying you can obviously, that's the first place. GPT.
Well, DeepSeek now.
Yeah, I know. No, but you can go on a more serious historical website. As far as kind of popular historians that describe this incident, do you know Montefiore? His book, Young Stalin? You can read that book. It's in that book. I'm not a huge fan of that particular historian, but it's certainly described in detail that, that event. It's mentioned in the diaries of the wife of the cyclist, right? The Kamo who died in this accident. And it's mentioned in numerous other sources. So this is a well-known event. If you go, we don't like Wikipedia, but you can even find links to newspapers from 1907, which is when this event took place. According to the old calendar, it was June 13th. According to the new calendar, it's June 26th. But for the sake of our story, 13th and 13th really matched really nicely to show kind of this weird fate of Kamo, who was the muscle.
It's a great number.
I know. It's like a lucky 13 or unlucky 13. It's really kind of interesting. So yeah, this is a totally true story. The details, as you could see, about the amounts really vary. I've seen amounts starting from In the old money, it was 200,000 rubles, but some sources are saying it was as much as 350,000 rubles and higher. I'm only going by public information. Maybe there is an archive that has a very specific number, but the sources are reputable, so perhaps that information is also a little bit iffy. But like I said, even if it's the smaller number, it's still around $6 million in today's conversion. And I actually put it into the converter to verify whether that was true. So maybe as far as high as 16, but maybe as low as 6, but still a really huge amount back in the day. Now, what sets this group apart from, this was the Bolsheviks, of course, is that when they were participating in these heists, it wasn't for the sake of we're going to go to casinos, buy chicks, and party. They were obtaining these funds for revolutionary purposes. So it was all going into kind of like a common shared, not an actual bank account, but basically kind of a, wherever they kept their money, the physical money, right? So they were very, go ahead.
I was right on that one. On that one, I was spot on.
You're right. It was, yes, this was definitely an ideologically motivated act. This was not purely for, I need lots of money to go party. And they basically perceived this as, they actually called it for a long time expropriations. They didn't call it a robbery. They didn't call it a heist. So they perceived it as taking money away from those who obtained it in ways that are structurally, in terms of a societal structure, unfair. Therefore, it was completely fair for take this money away from them and use it for revolutionary purposes. So it's almost like a little bit of this Robin Hood thinking, but on a greater scale. They were not just taking it and giving it to, the individual poor. They were using it for the greater purpose of basically fighting the Tsarist system, which they opposed. Eventually, Lenin started calling it, he kind of thought expropriation was a little bit of a bulky term, although it made sense. This is what they perceived it as. They basically started calling it robbing the robbers. So they're basically, we're going to rob the people that initially obtain the money in ways that are not socially fair. So if you think about them being inspired by Karl Marx and the unfairness of social relations under capitalism and capital accumulation. So this is what they're thinking of, basically, that these people either in business or in the highest positions of political power appropriate this money from the lower classes, right? The working class, the agrarian, the peasant class. And so they should not really have this money. Therefore, it's perfectly fine to appropriate it from them. I mean, obviously, based on the casualties of this particular attack, it doesn't seem like they had much concern about the civilians that are completely average people just walking around in the morning. And this happened in Tbilisi, Georgia. So it's a large city. And yeah, it didn't seem to be really concerned about those casualties either. So you can kind of see how, even though they had these Robin Hood type ideals, they didn't seem to care about the average people that might be hurt. And, obviously this then comes out with the scope and scale of the civil war in which they participated. Now, it's also important to mention that the Bolsheviks split from the Mensheviks within what was basically a rough equivalent of a social democratic party in Russia. It was a labor party. It had connections to other social democrat parties in other parts of Europe. And the Bolsheviks were more extreme ideologically. So there was that disconnect between the two, although they still had some connections and they had communication with other leftist worker parties in Europe. But when it came out that it was the Bolsheviks behind this heist and the bloodiness and the violence of it, a lot of these European parties really didn't want much to do with the Bolsheviks. So their reputation really decreased after that, beyond being perceived as more ideologically aggressive and more radical than their Menshevik counterparts. Just that the news of the heist and the reality of it was really, really hit them hard in terms of publicity. And that was one of the reasons why both Lenin and Stalin really tried to distance themselves. Now, in terms of money, they were using it exactly, what revolutionaries would use it for, right? Any kind of day-to-day expenses. They were, back in the day before the age of the internet, they would not share our ideology through memes. They had to publish things. So they would publish books and flyers and basically try to disseminate their information in this way. But of course, they also needed money for more serious things, exactly like you said. So firearms, firearms, explosives, bribing anyone in the chain for any future acts of this nature as well. And this particular time was really interesting because we usually think of the 1917 revolution as sort of this major change in government, a violent change in government in Russia. But we sometimes forget, especially outside of Russia, the 1905 revolution. It was sort of a failed revolution. It came in the wake of the Russo-Japanese War that Russia lost. There was a lot of social unrest. The government cracked down on some of the participants, and this was not a good look for them. So all of those things that were sort of brewing underneath well, not really quite underneath the surface. There are lots of these rebel groups, let's call them, revolutionary groups, starting from the latter part of the 19th century, the nihilists, the anarchists, people who would sometimes carry out other acts of terrorism, sometimes successfully. Remember the assassination of Alexander II, the Tsar, certain ministers. There were smaller assassinations too. So all of that was still happening, and it sort of culminated in this 1905 failed revolution. There was still some unrest going into 1906. Now, the state did try to respond, but the response was insufficient. There was a little bit more emphasis put on the Russian parliament, the Russian Duma, and the different parties that could participate there. But I think some of these revolutionaries saw all of this as being, still operating within the Tsarist government. So for them, it was grossly insufficient having more of a pluralism in this parliament. And so this is the general social context for this particular heist. So the 1905 revolution, the failure, the need to sort of persist with what they perceived as the struggle against the system that they really despised. They need to fund the struggle, and the funding of the struggle had to happen through basically criminal means. And that's basically the summary of the story. Like I said, there are other participants in the story, but for the sake of brevity, I limited it to just these three individuals, including, Lenin and Stalin obviously being the two most important ones.
The
Go
fun
ahead.
part is that you remember when I told that there's one Netflix series, documentary series, and a movie. So this movie is about a hoist to the central bank of Brazil, where it was actually made to finance the communist revolution in Brazil. Was one of the, so it was we are talking here in the I don't know, 60s perhaps. It's completely different time period, but yet it was done for the purpose of trying to finance the rise of communism in Brazil. Interesting times, we're talking 60s, 70s. Interesting times that we know one day we're going to talk about this. It culminated in all the military dictatorships in South America, in Latin America in general, well, in Europe as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think when you actually think about the way these things have to be practically managed and where the money comes from, it's, obviously sometimes it's really not a very pretty picture, but there is a way that they explained it to themselves ideologically. And again, this is one of these episodes where I don't think we'll ever know the role of Stalin. Personally, if I were to think about, his personality, as we learned about it later, as an actual statesman, I don't really see him as physically participating as the guy who is literally dropping explosives from roofs. I kind of see him as either observing the success or failure of the operation from far away, or as being removed. I kind of think it's sort of in between there. I don't personally think he participated in this, but who knows? He was young. He might have been a hothead. He had been arrested before in a different city in Baku where he lived. So maybe at the time he was as hot-headed as his younger 25-year-old friend, the muscle, who just had no filter. He just went for it. So perhaps Stalin participated in this as well. But yeah, I don't think we'll ever know because he really never talked about this. And we are getting this information from eyewitnesses and other sources. But yeah, I think it's kind of interesting to look at the early lives lives of these revolutionaries and just sort of the crazy things they did to get to where they needed to be, and sometimes not really having much concern about the collateral damage. Now, of course, you could argue that in a civil war and the aftermath, the collateral damage is much, much higher. But I guess in their mind, at least, there is, certain social restructuring that's going to take place. And ultimately, it's violence for greater good. Take that however you want. I think it's a very difficult question.
I really can see him participating, perhaps not directly on the muscle part. The two guys are very smart and ruthless.
Yeah.
So it can be very well thought, and you have the guy that had the bomb blowing in his face, and he got all right.
He's like, no worries, I'm just gonna keep going.
Yeah. So I can see the lack of care for the people that got injured and killed, and I can also see them, on the roof, quietly smoking their cigarettes or whatever, and just
it's all going according to plan. Gotta crack a few eggs. Yeah. And the connection to our previous. All for the revolution, yes. And the connection to a previous episode is that Lenin actually lived in Finland. So this is how far they had to carry the mattress from Georgia in the Caucasus to Finland. And then Lenin ended up fleeing eventually when he heard about the arrest of Camon in Germany, and eventually was extradited to the Russian Empire. He had to flee over ice from Finland into other European countries. So this is our little connection to our previous episode. But yeah, when I think about the mattress stuffed with money, I mean, I don't know if they eventually sort of separated it, but the initial transfer in a mattress, it's just, to me, it's like a little cartoon where people are trying to steal something and they're taking the most obvious thing, and it's like they got away with it. Yeah, and
as you said, they divided themselves around Europe and even to the United States, so they probably chopped that up into pillows.
Yeah, maybe smaller pillows. Well, apparently some of the money they were able to exchange in the US. I'm not sure if the information didn't get to the US in terms of like the cooperation with the Russian police. Definitely there was more international cooperation with the European counterparts. I don't think Interpol was launched up until like the 1920s. So they used some other mechanisms. I'm not as familiar with, the way international police cooperation would have worked at this time. But definitely they were, on guard. And I think Europeans were also concerned about any kind of revolutionary activities. They knew about their own left-wing labor parties, and they might have been worried that something like that would happen in their countries too. So it was in their interest to cooperate with the Russian authorities and basically extradite as quickly as possible. But it just seems like a very interesting time with people that you trust turn out to be informants. People that are supposed to be working for the Treasury are also informants, but for the criminal side of the enterprise here, there are all these informants everywhere. No one could be trusted. People can flee from country to country, cross borders on ice. Not a lot of passport control. So very very different from the way people operate today, which I also thought was very interesting. But yeah, that's all I have for you guys for this particular episode. I haven't been watching the comments because I've been blabbing. So if there are any questions, Marcelo, let me know. But I'm assuming it's just comments.
Yeah, it's mostly comments. One comment, a couple of comments I found interesting, but I would say one comment especially caught my attention because of the historical comments, and it was from Pidurpan, who was complaining for the first 20 or 30 minutes that you were keeping the city secrets, and why all this mystery and all that. This is not nice, but I'll keep watching because he's curious, of course. And at some point he wrote, cool way to tell this tale, Nina.
Well, that's the point of history story times, you guys. Go back to our other ones. This is pretty much the way we tell them, is that we do not reveal the identities. Sometimes it's kind of hard to conceal them, but basically we tell the story and then we set the context by explaining who the people are. And in some cases, it's, kind of really surprising, as Marcelo, you were surprised about this, because usually when we think of Stalin, we don't think about him, hiding in apartments and making homemade explosive devices and attacking trains and talking to informants in the state treasury and so on and so forth. But that is, his revolutionary past. Well, this is a shorter episode.
Said something interesting that came to my mind also, was that Stalin probably sent that truck to take the guy down.
This is actually one of the conspiracy theories. I don't know if Stalin sent the truck, but I did see that there is a conspiracy theory where the date was important. And it could have been some kind of a design act. I think this was 1922. Stalin was not yet sort of right. I mean, he was very important, but Lenin was still alive. He was still the official leader of the party. Lenin died in 1924. So I don't know if Stalin would have done that. I mean, this was almost like his childhood friend here, but perhaps definitely something that you'll see in the tinfoil hat side of things, that it wasn't just a crazy turn of fate where he ends up dying on the same date, but actually that it was planned and he was taken out for doing this. But I don't know if we'll ever know. So this is a shorter episode. Thank you guys for tuning in. Marcelo, any parting words?
Remember, all the links for the social media are on
especially the comments after the live is done. That would be very helpful. I would appreciate it.
Exactly. Remember to comment. That really does make a difference for the channels. Comments, likes, subscribing, all that.
But especially the comments. I don't know what it is. I don't know, Marcelo, if the X/Twitter and YouTube are identical, but they're similar in a way. I mean, my Twitter is much larger, right? 245,000. But I note that if I'm retweeted by a big account and then I have a lot of comments, all of a sudden the post is boosted and it just keeps going. Yeah, the reach can go from like 5,000 to 50, 100 and into millions, right? So I've noted that comments really help. YouTube is a little bit different because it shows things to a smaller audience and then a larger audience. But I think the idea is generally similar. If there is engagement, not just likes and views, but also comments and debates, then it's helpful. Comments, but anyway.
In principle, I was just watching today the YouTube guideline video that they have, a channel for that. And the lady was saying that, some things matter, but engagement and comments is the best engagement.
And I hate to be the person who was like, please comment on my YouTube, but if the big channels are doing it, then why shouldn't a little channel on this particular platform like me shouldn't do it as well? But anyway, thank you guys for any help you can offer. Thank you for tuning in. I think we'll do, I know we haven't done these history story times in a couple of months, but I think we'll do some more because, well, for me, it's fun. Actually, regardless of the engagement, I think for me, it's just kind of fun to do some storytelling, but we'll definitely intersperse it with interviews and politics. And yeah, thank you for tuning in. We will see you in the next one. Bye.
I'll just thank Fabiano for super chat. Thank you very much. See you guys on the next one. See you, Nina.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.